very, very excited to introduce Dr. Sam Gandy today. So Sam has a PhD in ecology from the University of Aberdeen and a research master's in entomology from Imperial College London. He's been all over the world doing his research and is a very active scientific communicator, both through his writing and role in ecological outreach. He is also on the edge of psychedelic research, working with the Imperial Psychedelic Research Group. And as such, we are so excited to have him here today and can't think of anyone better to talk to us about psychedelics and nature connectedness. So with that, I will hand over to you, Sam.
Hi there. I'm going to talk about the capacity of psychedelics to act as agents that can enhance our connection to nature and the implications of that. So I'm going to look at some of the work that's been done and is being done in this field. So before I begin, I think it's important to state what I mean by nature connectedness or nature relatedness, as it's sometimes known, because it's referring to something quite specific. And it's been defined as a sustained awareness of the interrelatedness of the self with the rest of nature, or an effective cognitive sense of oneness with the natural world. And so it's measured. There are a variety of nature connectedness and nature relatedness scales, and it's something you have to ask people. It's a qualitative, subjective and highly personal thing. You can't put someone in a brain scanner and look at their brain and sort of get a handle on their connection to nature. So people tend to sort of answer a list of questions that sort of probe your relationship with nature from sort of different angles, and then you answer on a sliding scale, and then a kind of composite mean of those things is taken. It's important to note that nature connectedness is considered as a sort of trait, similar to a personality trait, and it's quite change resistant. It's not a particularly easy thing to sort of change in a robust and in an enduring way, and it's declining at this time, and that's happening for a number of reasons. Partly, it's being exacerbated by increasing technological usage and dependency, so electronic entertainment technology, smartphone usage, things like that. And this seems to be an issue, particularly in children and the young. And at the same time as well, there's an extinction, what's been referred to as an extinction of experience. So this is a diminished capacity for everyday interactions with nature and sensorial contact with non-human organisms. And that's happening as a result of urbanization. So about half of all humans live in cities, and by 2050, it's going to be closer to 3/4. So there tends to be less nature in urban environments, and biodiversity is also sort of declining globally as well. Nature connectedness has been defined as a basic psychological need of human beings, and it's strongly associated with psychological well-being, particularly eudaimonic well-being, which encompasses self-actualization, or a life of virtue in the pursuit of human excellence. It's been defined. And this sort of is an umbrella term for different sort of facets, that things like vitality, life meaning, life satisfaction, feelings of worthwhileness, things like this. In addition, it's been associated with psychological restoration and resilience. This figure featured here is taken from a study that was published last year, and it looked at a variety of things. So use of like local urban green spaces, watching nature documentaries, socioeconomic status, and nature connectedness. And it found that nature connectedness was about 4 times more powerful in predicting well-being than socioeconomic status. So this sort of gets across how important this is for human well-being. And obviously nature connectedness runs very deeply. You know, it's a very ancient thing, our connection to nature, whereas our socioeconomic status is a much more recent cultural concoction. Relevant to the times we find ourselves in, nature connectedness as well is also a strong psychological predictor of environmental concern and pro-environmental behavior. So it seems that sort of as our connection to nature and the natural world increases, as a sort of side effect, our concern for it increases as well. And this sort of hints to sort of, I guess, an externalizing of one's awareness, because as your pro-environmental sort of behaviors and attitudes also sort of correlate with pro-social attitudes and behaviors towards human beings. Just to touch on some of the psychedelic research that's sort of been done looking at nature connectedness so far. So there's been a few retrospective studies looking at sort of back in time at past psychedelic use, and 3 separate studies have all found kind of a strong link between total lifetime usage of classical psychedelics and people's nature relatedness at baseline. And it's also interesting to note as well, there's been one small study that was a subsample of people having psilocybin for major depression conducted by Imperial College, and it found that there was this before and after sort of increase in nature relatedness, and this was persistent 7 to 12 months after the experience. And separate study that actually pulled data from 8 separate studies administering psilocybin to healthy volunteers found that there were enduring positive changes to people's relationship with nature and the environment that were persistent 8 to 16 months post experience. So it seems these shifts in one's relationship to nature can be quite persistent. This is an ongoing study from Imperial College, the Insight study. So here, psilocybin's been administered to healthy psychedelic naive people to look at the effects on the brain via MRI, and also that the effects on their psychology, including sort of longer term. And as you can see here, looking at these 3 graphs on this figure, which is taken from a presentation about this study, the effects on connectedness to nature is quite marked and robust and sort of sustained at sort of 3 weeks post psilocybin experience. So this is sort of an ongoing study that I think will sort of hopefully bolster this kind of emerging field once it's published. And sort of building on that, in terms of the sustained effects on nature connectedness, it's important to mention pre-existing nature connectedness enhancing interventions. These take the form of things like wilderness retreats, like prolonged nature immersion retreats, educational programs with a strong nature component, and programs that encourage, say, daily interaction or engagement with nature over, say, a 30-day time window. And the things these all have in common is they obviously require intentionality. All these different sort of approaches, they're all done with the prior intent to increase nature connectedness. They tend to be time and resource heavy, so they can last days or weeks. And there's a sort of lack of evidence at this time showing sustained change, particularly beyond the 3-month window post-intervention. So this is relevant here to the psychedelic side of things, because just even a single high dose of a psychedelic such as psilocybin can elicit rapid, robust and sustained increases in nature connectedness, and this can last at least a year and quite possibly more. And very intriguingly and quite sort of distinctly compared to other nature connectedness enhancing interventions, it can yield this shift even when administered in clinical nature deprived settings, and it can do this blindly without the prior intentionality of increasing nature connectedness. And this is really interesting because this is novel. This is not shared by any other nature connectedness enhancing interventions. And it's really quite mysterious and interesting. And to sort of speculate a little bit on what might be occurring here, among other things, it could be that when sort of people have a high dose of psychedelic, even when they're having it in a clinical setting outside of a natural environment, one is perhaps tuning in to their own inner processes of biology in the brain. So while they might not be connecting to external nature, they're perhaps connecting to their own internal nature, because of course we are all nature, whether we're sort of aware of that or not. Looking at some of the other research that's been done, this time on ayahuasca. Ayahuasca users have been found to sort of rate more highly in this trait of self-transcendence, which is kind of related to openness, and it sort of encompasses the feeling of sort of transcending the boundaries of the self to encompass much sort of broader, more cosmic or spiritual perspectives or ideas. And it's been found to be a significant positive predictor of nature connectedness and environmental concern. This is some research from the Center of Psychedelic Research at Imperial that I was involved in. And this was a kind of prospective survey study looking at people's before and after, and then long-term follow-up of their psychedelic usage. And we here in this figure we can see sort of total lifetime usage of classical psychedelics. So the usual suspects like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, ayahuasca, mescaline, and people's mean nature relatedness at baseline. And we found this very clear and strong effect of total lifetime usage of psychedelics and people's nature relatedness. But I should also add that we did find, even after a single use of a psychedelic in people who'd never taken any before, there was this noticeable increase in nature relatedness. And as sort of positive predictors of nature relatedness increase, we also found that ego dissolution experiences predicted an increase in nature connectedness, kind of echoing previous retrospective studies. And we also found that access to natural environments during the acute experience were also predictive of this increase. And we also found the nature connectedness relatedness increase also was strongly associated or correlated with psychological well-being, which echoes much other previous research. Just to get across how this sort of nature connection might be experienced during the acute psychedelic session, there's a few accounts here from one of the studies that kind of get across how this might be experienced. Before I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before I was looking at it as a thing, like TV or a painting. You're part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves. I was nature. So yeah, just to sort of touch on the ego dissolution experience. So under a high dose for psychedelic like psilocybin, so the ego or the subjective sense of self-identity can start to break down and dissolve. And one of the things the ego does is sort of, it's what sort of makes us feel separate from everything and everyone else. And so when that sort of structure starts to sort of break down, the perceived boundaries between self and other or self and nature start to sort of dissolve. And it seems that this can kind of facilitate this expanded perception of self, other or self nature overlap. And this can be sort of quite a powerful visceral experience that can leave a kind of indelible mark and then inform one's perspective on how they relate to life and the wider environment after that experience. And we've also, this experience is also strongly correlating with the mystical type experiences that are occasioned by high dose psychedelics. And this is important as well because there was a study published last year, and it was looking at people's first time psychedelic uses, and also at the mystical experience that these occasioned in particular. And so the most common prolonged after effect of these experiences was this positive shift in people's relationship to nature after the experience. And yeah, it should also be noted that nature-based settings are sort of prone to or known to kind of elicit transcendent and mystical experiences themselves, which is important because the mystical type experiences, as we know from the research, is a sort of a strong predictor of long-term benefits and therapeutic outcomes. Something that the mystical experience has been associated with is enduring increases in personality trait openness to experience. And openness is sort of encompasses a few different things. One of them notably is aesthetic experience and appreciation. And this is something that's sort of also been found long-term across numerous different psilocybin studies, is this change, this positive shift in aesthetic experiencing. And this is important because aesthetic appreciation for nature and the appreciation of beauty in nature is a powerful pathway to enhanced nature connectedness. Its openness itself was also strongly associated with nature connectedness itself. Psilocybin's also been known to lower neuroticism levels, and this is important because people with lower neuroticism tend to gain greater psychological benefits following contact with nature. Another important thing that nature connectedness is linked to is mindfulness. So numerous psychedelics such as ayahuasca, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT have been shown to elicit long-term or sort of sustained increases in mindfulness-related capacities. And this has happened outside of a kind of meditation type context. And this is important because nature connectedness and mindfulness appear to have a sort of reciprocal, positively reinforcing relationship. So if you increase one, you tend to sort of increase the other. In addition to these sort of predictors of nature connectedness enhancement, during sort of the acute psychedelic state, there's sort of commonality in the mechanisms in terms of the neurobiology and psychology of what's going on between the psychedelic experience and what's happening when you're immersed in nature. One of these is, and an important one, is connectedness. And I mean this in a broad sense. So not just to nature. Connectedness can encompass things like connectedness to self, connectedness to other people, and connectedness to nature, world, universe, or a spiritual principle. And it seems that simply acknowledging nature is a pathway to broad connectedness increase, not just to it, but to self, others, and world. And this is also a fundamental component of the psychedelic state and the long-term effects as well. So this shift in nature connectedness or increase that's happening isn't isolated. Like there's a broad level of increase sort of going on here. And yeah, the experience of ego dissolution and sort of experiences in nature, there's a lot of overlap. So ego dissolution and nature connectedness have been defined actually in very similar terms as a sort of dissolving of or dissolution of self-referential boundaries. So you then sort of encompass more. And this is also a fundamental component of the experience of awe. And this is something that's very much tied to contact with nature, and it's also a fundamental property of the psychedelic state as well. And yeah, that experience of being small, the small self in sort of relation to something much bigger and greater than oneself. And this is a really important emotional sort of cognitive state to experience. It has a lot of psychological benefits. Both psychedelics, at least sort of longer term, post sort of the acute phase, and contact with nature, both are known to reduce negative affect or propensity to experience negative mood states. Neurobiologically, both contact with nature and psychedelics such as psilocybin are known to increase functional connectivity between brain regions, but also importantly reduce rumination and activity in the default mode network. And this is important because rumination is associated with things like depression and anxiety and persistent PTSD. So given these various overlapping psychological and neurobiological mechanisms shared by nature, contact, connectedness, and psychedelics, what can we do to sort of use them to maximize the total overall benefits to mental health while maximizing nature connectedness? So there's a number of different sort of avenues here and options that can be incorporated at various different phases of psychedelic sessions at the preparation, session, and integration phases. One thing that's I think kind of worthy of incorporation is nature-based journaling. So research by Johns Hopkins, it looked at the effect of spiritual practices alongside psilocybin sessions, and it found that these practices very much augmented and extended the long-term therapeutic gains obtained. And this has been echoed in other studies that psychedelics tend to have more benefits when they're used alongside an ever pre-existing practice of some kind. One such practice looked at was journaling, which is known to have therapeutic potential on its own. And this is interesting because there's been a study looking at nature-based journaling where people simply recorded 3 things a day over a 5-day sort of time window, things about nature that they enjoyed or loved or cherished, and they simply made a note of that, and that was found to sort of elicit a fairly sort of sustained increase in people's nature connectedness. So it seems that incorporating some nature-based journaling either side of a psychedelic session could sort of be quite an easy way of sort of maximizing nature connectedness enhancement, perhaps. Shinrin-yoku, which is otherwise known as Japanese forest bathing, is essentially an active form of nature-based mindfulness. So taking place in a woodland environment, and it kind of gets you to sort of slow down and tune into your various other senses. And it seems that sort of this might be a useful practice, particularly say for people who are, I don't know, going out to Peru and drinking ayahuasca there, say, and then they're kind of coming back and integrating into a busy, frenetic urban existence. That could potentially be a little bit jarring, and some sort of soothing, restorative, de-stressing practice like this, I think, could be a really beneficial integration tool. And then because it's an easy, accessible practice, it's the kind of thing you can do in pairs or small groups or even on your own if you want. Awe walks are an ever interesting avenue, I think, worthy of incorporation. So a study looking at awe walks, essentially people undertook a 15-minute walk once a week over an 8-week time frame for the study that looked at them, and people were very simply briefed to tap into their childlike sense of wonder at the world and to actively seek out experiences of awe. And so essentially just a mindful walk in a sense, but seeking awe. And although it seems sort of quite fairly simple, it had quite powerful effects on people's psychological well-being. So sort of mental distress kind of went down, pro-social feelings and well-being increased, and also awe increased. Like the more people sought out awe, the more they found it. And we know from some of the research that's been done that while awe is a fundamental property of the acute psychedelic state, it also persists beyond that, interestingly. So it seems like awe walks sort of following a psychedelic experience could sort of work quite well in nature-based settings. Horticultural therapy, there's definitely sort of room, I think, for incorporating practices here. One study, a sort of early pioneering study by friend and colleague Dr. David Luke on psychedelics and nature connectedness. I think he had a sample size of 150 people, and all of them reported feeling more nature connected following their psychedelic experiences. And interestingly, about 50% said they took up gardening following their experiences to various degrees. And practices like, say, tending the ground and the soil before you sort of go into a session, like you're sort of preparing your mind to sort of go into this experience, and then perhaps afterwards or before, you could plant a seed which you then sort of take away in a pot, and then you sort of will nurture that sprout and that plant as you're hopefully nurturing and sort of grounding those insights that arose during your session. As well, there's great potential, I think, in outdoor walk and talk therapy in nature-based settings, and outdoor therapy has its own sort of potential advantages compared to sort of in a clinical indoor setting. So a clinician and their patient can feel sort of they're more equal in a neutral outside nature-based situation compared to sort of being in a clinical context where the clinician might be behind a desk, or sort of there might be a bit of a power dynamic there. So that's part of it, but as well, both the clinician and the patient benefit from that contact with nature, and there's the potential to sort of build up this connection to the natural outside area as a source of therapeutic benefit itself. So outside of the therapeutic time, the person can kind of return to nature to self-soothe on their own terms. And given what we know of the potential of psychedelics to actively facilitate connection to meaningful connection to nature, it seems that there could be real potential here. I know some people have expressed like the desire of having, say, hiring a therapist and sort of going off, I guess, hiking, going off into nature, having had a dose of a psychedelic. It seems to me that doing something active like this, full doses would not be really feasible or perhaps wise, because they're a bit incapacitating. So it might be a lower dose protocol, but this seems like something that could perhaps be interesting. Barefoot walking could be added as a potential side option. That's been shown to increase nature connection, because sensory contact and engagement with nature is one pathway to nature connectedness. And obviously, that might include like smelling flowers and hearing bird song and seeing the sunlight through the trees, but actually feeling the earth beneath your feet is an extra kind of sensory modality that's being sort of connected there. If we want to go whole hog, we could potentially build psychedelic centers in sort of beautiful nature-based settings, so coastal or woodland environments. We can incorporate biophilic design elements into their structures. We could have sort of large windows and a skylight, and so people have got the view of the vistas and the trees, or the coast, or the stars, or the sky above. So then the treatment sort of facilitator could titrate the amount of nature immersion depending on the wants and needs of the patient sort of undergoing that. And it seems that this might be some time away, but it seems like a wise move forward would be, if we can't take people out into nature in a psychedelic state, and obviously there are issues with the unpredictability of outside environments, perhaps we can kind of incorporate more nature into the actual clinical space. I mean, one of the great advantages of the clinical approach as it exists now, we know it works because there's good data to show that, it helps keep people safe and secure. However, there's not the setting tends to feature as a sort of container of safety. People are wearing eye shades and headphones, and they're sort of instructed to go inside and do some psychological spring cleaning, and that's a really important part of the therapeutic process. So certainly that shouldn't be dismissed. However, not much use is being made of the external setting at this time. And it seems that sort of a nature-based setting in the right situation could allow for a more kind of externally interconnected based experience, which might have its own certain benefits. So as mentioned, this is a kind of newly emerging area. There's the study I mentioned before coming from the Centre of Psychedelic Research at Imperial, looking at psilocybin in healthy and also people with depression as well, looking at the effects on nature connectedness. So that's sort of in the pipeline. In addition, I'm involved with a study looking at ayahuasca usage in a traditional indigenous shaman-led center in the Peruvian Amazon, and looking at effects on nature connection there. So that will be sort of quite different, but I think an interesting addition here. And sort of another thing that needs to happen, I think, to kind of take the research forward is, so far, you know, it's been primarily survey studies, and we've relied on self-reports for people's access to nature-based environments. But in order to sort of take the rigor of the science forward, we need direct control, I think, over the types of natural environments that people have access to. So that's sort of standardized and controlled. This is a review paper I worked on with a number of scientific collaborators, and it sort of encompasses a lot of what I've been talking about here. I mean, it's freely available and open access. So if you'd like to sort of do a bit more reading and delve into the literature on this, yeah, please by all means check it out. So yeah, one of the interesting consequences of enhancing nature connectedness is that it tends to predict the likelihood of spending time in nature and the relationship, the value of the relationship one places on nature. I recall that David Luke's study on psychedelics and nature connection, he also looked at sort of contact with nature, and it was virtually, there was barely any people at all reported having less contact with nature as a result of their psychedelic experiences. A small amount said about the same, but the majority, I think the vast majority, reported more contact with nature following their psychedelic experiences. And this is important because nature contact is associated with a broad array of health benefits itself. Nature connectedness acts as an important mediator for some of these, some of the affective and cognitive benefits obtained following contact with nature. So by facilitating greater contact with nature, we can kind of make the most of a highly underutilized and undervalued health promoting resource. And this is also relevant to the situation we find ourselves in. You know, human beings are unleashing the 6th great mass extinction of life on this planet single-handedly, and there's a notable lack of effective interventions for kind of reducing or reversing people's environmentally destructive behavior. And no amount of sort of rational scientific evidence seems to be shifting that particularly. And it's important to note that nature connectedness is something emotional and experiential and personal and direct. So there's potential by increasing it, we can increase environmental awareness and concern. And by doing so, by reversing this trend of disconnection, there's potential synergistic benefits here for both the individual human and sort of the planet and as a whole. And, you know, I don't in any way want to sort of come across as evangelical. I don't view psychedelics as magic bullets or a panacea of any kind, but they do have potential as catalysts of connection. You know, on the level of the neuron, they increase synaptic dendritic formation. On the level of the brain, they increase global brain connectivity, and they can connect us to ourselves, to other people, and the planet and universe as a whole. So used well and used with care, they could be tremendously helpful, I think, at this time. Thank you.